They believed the United States was still learning how to fight a naval war. They believed American commanders relied on numbers instead of skill, on industrial power instead of intelligence, and on luck instead of strategy. In the eyes of the Japanese Empire, the U.S. Navy was large but clumsy, powerful but predictable, and ultimately incapable of winning a decisive battle in the vastness of the Pacific. For a brief moment in history, much of the world believed that as well. But in June of 1942, on a small cluster of islands surrounded by thousands of miles of open ocean, the United States proved something that would echo through the rest of the war. When underestimated, America becomes unstoppable. 6 months earlier, Pearl Harbor burned. American battleships sank as smoke rose into the Hawaiian sky, and Japan believed it had delivered a blow that would keep the United States out of the Pacific for years. To Tokyo, the message was clear. The Imperial Navy ruled the seas, and any American response would be slow, disorganized, and easy to crush. In their calculations, the war was already moving toward a Japanese victory. But for the United States, Pearl Harbor was not an ending, it was an awakening. As Japan surged forward across the Pacific, capturing territory, destroying enemy fleets, and expanding its maritime empire, something far less visible was taking place on the American side of the ocean. It did not appear on maps, it did not explode or leave craters behind. In quiet rooms far from the battlefield, American officers studied radio signals, intercepted messages, and patterns hidden inside streams of enemy communications. Japan was confident its naval codes were unbreakable, confident that no enemy could see beyond the wall of secrecy protecting its plans. That confidence would become one of the most costly mistakes of the war. Midway itself seemed insignificant, a tiny atoll in the middle of the Pacific, isolated, remote, and far from any major city. But strategically, Midway was the gateway to Hawaii, and in Japanese thinking, it was the perfect bait. The plan was elegant in its arrogance. Attack Midway, force the remaining American aircraft carriers to rush in its defense, and then destroy them in a single decisive ambush. Without carriers, the United States would lose its ability to project power across the Pacific. Without that ability, the war would be effectively over. The Japanese High Command had complete confidence in this plan. They believed they knew where the Americans were, how they would react, and how they would fight. What they did not know was that the United States already understood the plan with terrifying clarity. The target was known, the timing was known, the direction of attack was known, and most importantly, American commanders knew they were being underestimated. Contrary to the image Japan held of its enemy, the U.S. Navy was not improvising. It was adapting rapidly. Every failure at Pearl Harbor had been studied, every mistake in coordination, every delay in response, every weakness exposed in the opening months of the war had been analyzed and corrected. Midway would not be another Pearl Harbor, it would be something entirely different. For the first time in the Pacific War, the United States would not react to the enemy. It would wait. It would not search blindly. It would position itself with intent, and it would not fight in the dark. It would see the enemy before the enemy ever realized he had been seen. As the Japanese fleet crossed the Pacific with confidence, believing it was sailing toward another inevitable victory, 3 American aircraft carriers moved silently into position. They were not superior in number, they were not overwhelming in strength, but they were exactly where they needed to be. Every mile sailed, every decision made, every moment of radio silence was part of a larger design, a design that would transform a Japanese trap into one of the greatest disasters in naval history. On the morning of June 4, 1942, Japanese aircraft struck Midway, convinced that surprise was still on their side. Bombs fell, runways burned, and Japanese commanders waited for the American response that would confirm everything they believed about their enemy. But that response did not come as expected.
Instead of chaos, there was precision. Instead of confusion, there was coordination. Instead of panic, there was confidence. What was about to unfold would be more than a military victory. It would be a psychological shock, a moment when the Japanese Empire would realize, far too late, that the United States was not merely fighting the war, it was redefining how the war would be fought. Midway would not be remembered simply as a battle. It would be remembered as the day Japan discovered that it had awakened an enemy far more dangerous than it had ever imagined.
By the spring of 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy believed it had already proven itself superior. Pearl Harbor had stunned the world. Allied forces had been pushed back across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. British strongholds had fallen, American fleets had retreated, and Japan's carrier pilots were spoken of with near mythical respect. Within the Japanese High Command, there was a growing belief that the United States simply did not possess the experience, discipline, or resolve to fight a prolonged naval war at this scale. America, in their view, was powerful but naive, dangerous but predictable. This belief shaped everything that followed. Japanese strategy was built on the assumption that one decisive blow could shatter American will. If the remaining U.S. aircraft carriers could be destroyed in a single engagement, the Pacific would effectively belong to Japan. The war would not drag on for years. It would be ended quickly, cleanly, and decisively. Midway was chosen as the place where that final act would unfold. The plan itself was complex, ambitious, and fatally overconfident. Japanese forces would advance toward Midway from multiple directions, stretching American defenses and creating confusion. An invasion force would threaten the island directly, while the main carrier strike force waited nearby, ready to annihilate the American fleet once it rushed in to respond. In theory, it was brilliant. In practice, it relied on one dangerous assumption, that the Americans were blind. Japanese commanders believed that radio silence, distance, and deception had hidden their movements completely. They were confident that American intelligence had been shattered at Pearl Harbor, and that whatever remained was incapable of piecing together such a vast and intricate operation. The Imperial Navy had spent years perfecting operational secrecy, and they trusted it absolutely. That trust would become their undoing. What the Japanese did not fully understand was how quickly the nature of warfare was changing. This was no longer a war fought solely by ships and pilots. It was a war fought by analysts, cryptographers, and planners working far from the front lines. While Japanese admirals focused on maneuvering fleets across the ocean, American intelligence officers were quietly reconstructing the enemy's intentions, message by message, pattern by pattern. Every intercepted transmission added another piece to the puzzle. Even when some Japanese officers expressed concern that the plan was too complicated, too dependent on perfect timing and flawless execution, those doubts were dismissed. The Imperial Navy trusted in its past victories. It trusted in the skill of its pilots, and above all, it trusted in the belief that the Americans would behave exactly as expected, rushing forward in desperation, reacting too late, falling straight into the trap prepared for them. This confidence bordered on arrogance. Japanese commanders assumed that American pilots lacked the training to challenge them, that American carriers lacked the coordination to strike effectively, and that American leadership lacked the courage to risk everything on a single decisive gamble. In their minds, Midway was not a question of whether Japan would win, but how completely the United States would be defeated. Yet, on the American side, a very different mindset was taking shape. U.S. naval leadership understood its disadvantages. They knew their fleet was smaller, they knew their carrier force was fragile, and they knew that another defeat like Pearl Harbor could be catastrophic.
But instead of relying on overwhelming force, they chose something far more dangerous: calculated risk. American commanders understood that they did not need to outnumber the Japanese, they needed to outthink them. Midway was not about matching strength for strength, it was about striking at the precise moment when the enemy was most vulnerable. It was about patience, discipline, and the confidence to wait while the enemy moved exactly where he was expected to move. As Japanese ships closed in on Midway, their commanders believed they were tightening the noose around the American fleet. In reality, they were sailing deeper into a situation they no longer controlled. Every mile they advanced brought them closer to an enemy that knew they were coming, knew how they would attack, and knew when to strike back. The trap that was meant to end the war was already beginning to close, but not around the Americans. Unaware of how much had already been revealed, the Imperial Navy pressed forward with absolute confidence. Orders were issued, flight decks prepared, and pilots briefed for what many believed would be another historic victory. Few suspected that within hours, the balance of power in the Pacific would be shattered forever. Fewer still imagined that the United States, the nation they had dismissed as slow and inexperienced, was about to deliver one of the most devastating blows in naval history. Midway was supposed to confirm Japanese supremacy. Instead, it was about to expose a fatal truth. The United States had learned how to fight this war, and it had learned faster than anyone expected.
Dawn broke over the Pacific on June 4, 1942, with a sense of confidence aboard the Japanese fleet. To the commanders of the Imperial Navy, this was the final act of a plan that had been months in the making. Midway would be struck, American defenses would crumble, and the U.S. Navy would be forced to reveal itself. Everything was unfolding exactly as expected, or so it seemed. Shortly after sunrise, Japanese aircraft lifted off their carriers and headed toward Midway Atoll. The attack was precise, disciplined, and powerful. Bombs tore into airfields and installations, and smoke rose from the island as pilots reported successful strikes. To Japanese commanders, this confirmed their assumptions. Midway was vulnerable. The Americans were reacting too slowly, and the decisive fleet engagement they had anticipated was surely moments away. But while Japanese aircraft were returning from the attack, something deeply dangerous was happening aboard their carriers. Deck crews were racing against time. Aircraft were being refueled. Bombs and torpedoes were being moved across crowded flight decks. Planes originally armed for ship attacks were being reconfigured for another strike on Midway, based on reports that the island was not yet fully neutralized. This constant rearming created a brief but catastrophic window of vulnerability, one that Japanese commanders did not realize existed. At the same time, far beyond the horizon, American aircraft were already in the air. They had launched earlier, often under difficult conditions, flying long distances over open ocean with no guarantee of finding the enemy. Many of these pilots knew they might not return, yet they pressed forward, driven not by certainty, but by trust. Trust that their commanders had placed them in the right position at the right time for a reason. The first American attacks were chaotic and costly. Torpedo squadrons flew low and slow, directly into a storm of anti-aircraft fire and enemy fighters. One after another, American planes were shot down, crews lost to the sea. From the Japanese perspective, this only reinforced their confidence. They believed they were witnessing proof of American weakness, brave perhaps, but disorganized and ineffective. They did not realize that these early attacks were drawing Japanese fighters down low, pulling them away from the altitude where true danger was approaching. High above the battle, American dive bombers were still searching. Fuel gauges dropped, tension mounted. Minutes stretched endlessly as pilots scanned the ocean below. Many feared they had missed the enemy entirely. Then, in a moment that would define the battle, American aircraft spotted the Japanese carriers below. Decks crowded, planes exposed, defenses unprepared for an attack from above. What followed unfolded with breathtaking speed. American dive bombers rolled into steep descents, screaming toward the heart of the Japanese fleet. Bombs fell with devastating accuracy. Within minutes, fires raged across the decks of multiple carriers. Explosions tore through fuel lines and armed aircraft. The carefully maintained order of the Japanese fleet collapsed into chaos. For Japanese commanders, the shock was immediate and profound. This was not how the battle was supposed to unfold. They had believed themselves in control. They had believed the Americans were reacting blindly. Instead, the enemy had appeared suddenly, decisively, and at the worst possible moment. 3 Japanese carriers, symbols of imperial power, were crippled in a matter of minutes. Attempts to respond came too late. Confusion spread as damage reports flooded command centers. Orders conflicted. Crews fought fires that could not be contained. The realization slowly set in that this was not a temporary setback, but something far worse. The United States had not merely struck back, it had struck with devastating precision. By late morning, the balance of the battle had already shifted. What began as a confident Japanese offensive had turned into a desperate struggle for survival. The Imperial Navy had lost the initiative, the momentum, and the illusion of invulnerability it had carried since Pearl Harbor. And still, the battle was not over. As smoke rose from burning carriers and survivors were pulled from the water, one truth became impossible to ignore. The United States had done what no one believed it could do. It had found the Japanese fleet, it had struck first, and it had done so not by chance, but by design. The surprise that Japan had planned for its enemy had been turned against it. And as the day continued, the full cost of that realization was only beginning to unfold.
For a brief moment after the devastating American dive bomber attacks, silence settled over parts of the battlefield. Smoke rose from burning Japanese carriers, and stunned commanders struggled to understand how everything had unraveled so quickly. Yet the Imperial Navy was not finished. One carrier remained operational. One final chance still existed to strike back and restore honor, control, and momentum. That carrier was Hiryu. Determined to respond, Japanese pilots launched counterattacks against the American fleet. They moved with urgency, fueled by discipline and desperation. Before long, American lookouts spotted incoming aircraft. Sirens sounded across the decks. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire. The war had entered its most dangerous phase, where even victory could still be snatched away. The focus of the Japanese counterstrike became the USS Yorktown. Scarred but still operational, Yorktown represented the resilience of the American fleet. Despite damage suffered earlier in the war, it had been repaired with astonishing speed and returned to battle in time for Midway. Now it stood directly in the path of Japan's last meaningful blow. Japanese bombs struck with precision. Explosions ripped through the carrier. Fires broke out, and the ship began to list. For a moment, it appeared that Yorktown might be lost. Crews fought desperately to contain the damage, flooding compartments and extinguishing flames. Against expectations, the ship stabilized. From the Japanese perspective, this was proof that the battle was still winnable. They prepared another strike. When torpedoes later slammed into Yorktown, the situation changed irreversibly.
The carrier was mortally wounded. Though it would remain afloat for a time, its role in the battle was effectively over. For the United States, the loss was painful and deeply personal. Sailors had watched their ship absorb punishment, survive, and then finally succumb. Victory, it was clear, would not come without sacrifice. Yet even as Yorktown was being abandoned, American commanders understood something crucial. The Japanese had revealed their last card. Hiryu had exposed its position. The moment Japanese aircraft left its deck, American scouts traced their path back to the source. The final Japanese carrier had been found. American aircraft launched once more, driven by urgency and resolve. The pilots who took off knew exactly what was at stake. If Hiryu survived, the battle could still turn. If it was destroyed, the Imperial Navy's carrier force would be shattered beyond recovery. There would be no second chance. The attack came swiftly and decisively. American dive bombers descended on Hiryu with the same precision that had destroyed the earlier carriers. Bombs struck home. Fire spread uncontrollably. Within hours, Hiryu was a burning wreck, doomed to sink beneath the Pacific. With its loss, the Japanese Navy lost its final ability to strike back. For the first time since the beginning of the Pacific War, the Imperial High Command faced an unthinkable reality. Their carrier force, the core of their naval power, had been destroyed in a single battle. Their most experienced pilots were gone. Their carefully constructed strategy lay in ruins. The confidence that had carried them from Pearl Harbor to the edges of the Pacific had evaporated in a single devastating day. As night fell, the scale of the disaster became impossible to deny. The Imperial Navy had not simply lost ships, it had lost initiative, momentum, and belief in its own invincibility. Meanwhile, the United States, despite its losses, had proven something far more important than raw strength. It had demonstrated control. Control of timing, control of information, control of the battlefield itself. Midway was no longer a contested engagement. It had become a turning point. And with the destruction of Hiryu, the fate of the Japanese fleet and the direction of the war had been sealed.
When the fighting finally subsided, the ocean around Midway was littered with wreckage, oil slicks, and the remnants of a shattered illusion. For the Japanese Empire, the battle was more than a tactical defeat. It was a moment of reckoning. 4 aircraft carriers lay at the bottom of the Pacific. Hundreds of elite pilots, men who could not be replaced, were gone. The force that had delivered the stunning blow at Pearl Harbor no longer existed in any meaningful sense. In Tokyo, disbelief gave way to grim reality. Reports arriving from the front painted a picture that few had imagined possible. The Imperial Navy, long considered untouchable, had been decisively outmaneuvered. The carefully cultivated image of superiority had collapsed in just a few hours of combat. Midway was not supposed to be a gamble, it was supposed to be a confirmation of dominance. Instead, it became the moment Japan realized the war it had started could no longer be controlled. For the United States, the significance of Midway went far beyond the ships destroyed or the territory defended. It marked a fundamental shift in confidence. No longer was the U.S. Navy reacting to Japanese moves. No longer was it fighting from a position of recovery and uncertainty. At Midway, the United States seized the initiative, and it would never give it back. The victory proved that American industry, intelligence, and command could work together with devastating effectiveness. It showed that innovation could overcome experience, that preparation could defeat arrogance, and that discipline could triumph over overconfidence. Midway demonstrated that the United States was not merely capable of fighting a modern naval war, it was capable of mastering it.
From that point forward, the Pacific War began to change shape. Japan was forced onto the defensive, compelled to conserve resources it could no longer replace. Every loss hurt more deeply. Every retreat revealed how fragile its position had become. Meanwhile, American shipyards worked relentlessly, launching new carriers, new aircraft, and new fleets at a pace the world had never seen. Midway had bought the United States something invaluable: time. And time, combined with American production, would prove unstoppable. Perhaps most importantly, Midway shattered a myth. The myth that the United States lacked the resolve for a long war. The myth that American forces were slow to adapt. The myth that American victories would only come through overwhelming numbers. At Midway, America won not because it had more, but because it knew more, because it waited, because it struck when the moment was right. In the months and years that followed, American forces would advance across the Pacific, island by island, pushing ever closer to the Japanese homeland. Battles would be fought at Guadalcanal, at Leyte Gulf, at Iwo Jima, and at Okinawa. Each of those victories traced its roots back to Midway. The confidence born there would carry American sailors, pilots, and Marines through the hardest battles of the war. Midway stands as a reminder of what happens when preparation meets opportunity, of what happens when a nation learns from its failures and refuses to be defined by them. The Japanese believed they had awakened a sleeping giant at Pearl Harbor. At Midway, they finally understood what that truly meant. This was the moment the United States took control of the Pacific, not through luck, not through chance, but through intelligence, courage, and the unshakable determination to prevail.